We're going to go through a few examples of what I would call specialty reverb applications. Now, remember, it's not specialty as in this reverb is really special. It's the number of reverbs that you're using and how you're using them. So in the following video, we're going to look at a mixed reverb where everything is kind of going into that a little bit to add cohesion. Here we're thinking about reverb on individual tracks in the mix, maybe playing more of a specialty or specific role. All right, so that's really kind of the differential there. Here's the little loop that we're going to be working with.
Whatever you give is what you give.
And one other thing that you might want to do at this point in the mix when you're getting into specialty reverb and also specialty delay is to make sure that you kind of turn the volume up a little bit more. I am overdoing things for the sake of example here, but even so, I noticed with the delay from a couple videos ago that it was like way too loud when I actually turned the volume up. So you want to have the volume up a little louder so that you're making, I would say, somewhat better decisions where you're able to hear more detail. It's okay if it kind of disappears when it gets quieter. What you're more worried about is it becoming overpowering when somebody turns it up a lot louder. All right, so let's jump in here and let's first of all focus on this vocal part. And I want you to really listen to what happens when we have the parallel compressor in and out, okay? So you'll understand how this all relates back in a second, but let's just listen to this vocal. We'll get rid of the mix delay and just listen to the parallel compression and what effect it has.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
So yes, it is making it louder, but what it's also doing is making it brighter. And the reason is this is a very dark voice. There's a lot of content down in the low end. And so when we're compressing it and compressing it really hard, what's being compressed more is the fundamental areas, okay? So the low end, that's what's really driving the compressor, meaning that those upper frequencies are now going to be exposed more. And if we just listen to the parallel compressor in solo, you would hear that.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
Okay, so now if we listen to this vocal in context, I need to ask myself, do I need to make this any brighter? And what could I possibly use to do that?
Whatever you give is what you gave.
So it's fairly bright, it's almost there, but for my own taste, which again, this all comes down to your taste, I think we could enhance this a little more, get a bit more of that clarity, because remember, the vocal is the thing that's sitting up front. It's really what's the most important element here, and if a person is standing directly in front of you and talking, you will definitely hear more of the detail in the high end. You'll hear the breaths a little bit more. You'll really hear those S's. You'll hear some of those consonants because you're just that freaking close to them, right? There's no time for the high frequencies to be absorbed by the air. So you're going to hear it. You're going to hear all the detail. And that's what I want to try to bring out here. And that's where reverb and specifically early reflections can be very beneficial. So early reflections are defined differently from different sources, but for me, the way I tend to define early reflections, especially in this context, is you hear the early reflections as still belonging to the sound. Okay, there's not like this lingering tail that goes on. That would be the reverb. All right, so that would be the difference. That's how I would define it. That's not the technical definition, but you'll understand, I think, why I define it that way in this application. So we're going to grab this reverb. It's a different plugin, but again, it's very simple. I'm going to put the dry wet up to 100, mute the parallel compression, and start to maybe dial in some settings here.
Whatever you give is what.
So right now we can really hear a tail and we can hear that reverb, and that's from this late size box over here, what I would define really as being the reverb. So I'm just going to get rid of both of these, okay? And now we can listen back.
Whatever you give is what.
And here's where we are going to adjust, the quote unquote early reflections. There are plugins, paid plugins that I think do this a little bit better. But from experiments, I found that this actually gets you pretty close, especially if you do some additional processing. We have this listener position. So this is just what I was talking about before. If we go to the back of the room, we're really going to hear those early reflections mixed in with the original signal. So if I put this all the way back,
Whatever you give,
you hear it like so. And if we were to solo it, you would really tell.
whatever you give
We're going to bring it up quite a bit closer.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
So kind of like realism here in terms of what we're trying to apply. We want to pretend like as the listener, they're hearing the vocal right up front. That's what we're trying to get out of this. So now we can go in here and mess around with these additional parameters. This is interesting. So this is size. So if we go to a bigger room, it takes longer for the early reflections to come back to us, meaning that if we go all the way up to 100, we're going to hear an audible delay.
Whatever you give is what you gave. Whatever.
That's not what we really want, but actually being at 100% here is going to help us understand this diffusion setting. And I'm not going to try to define it because what I find is with every single reverb, they use diffusion differently, like the application of it and the way it sounds. So let's just listen to what happens if we put this all the way up.
Whatever you give is what you gave. Whatever.
So up to a certain point, it does what you would expect it to do, which is it adds density. That's what I think of with diffusion. A higher diffusion time or setting should equal more density in the reverb. And if we go lower, we should really just hear those like individual delays. So this would have to do with the surfaces in the room, okay? So if I was way up here, there would be a lot of diffuse surfaces, a lot of reflective surfaces causing this density buildup. But if I go down to the other side,
whatever you give is what you gave.
right? So we're starting to just hear those individual delays less processed. That's really all that's going on here. We're actually just having fewer delays. You can see the actual amount here with this little diagram. So for us, I'm going to probably go somewhere in the lower setting for diffusion and bring this early size down considerably. Okay, because I want the vocal to be up front. I don't want it to be in a huge room.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
There are definitely sweet spots with this thing.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
Okay, so I like that. And now we could put in a blend here and listen in context and bring back our mix delay.
Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give is what you give.
So I like the space that it's adding, but it actually seems to be losing clarity. So I think there's a reason for that. It's because they're kind of blending. There's kind of a little bit of a phase shift happening here. And so I could bring back in the parallel compressor. That would fix it. But why don't we try to just stick with one additional parallel chain here? And what I'm going to do on this parallel chain is similar to what I did with the parallel compressor. So now with the reverb, I could go in here and I could add, first of all, an EQ, which I'll do first. And I'm just going to brighten this up. So let's continue to listen, this time just to the vocal.
Whatever you give is what you gave. Whatever you give
Okay.
is what.
And then I'll follow that with a compressor. So what we're doing here is we're specifically EQing the early reflections, and now we're going to compress them really hard and kind of do what we did with the parallel compressor, only I don't think we'll have to go to quite as extreme settings. I've tried out basically every compressor that we have. The one that seems to work the best, and that's the easiest to program here, would be the M-Juice. The Kotelnikov also works great in this setting. The other ones, not so much. So we'll just try this out here.
Whatever you give
Go to auto.
Is what.
And I'm fine with a lot of gain reduction because we are processing in parallel.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
All right, so now let's get a blend.
Whatever you give is what you gave.
Put it back into context.
Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give.
You can also hear the added bit of dimension that's added from this delay. So it's very subtle. It's not something that a average listener is going to be able to pick out. And even if I was listening to a full mix, I wouldn't be able to tell you that there is like a send and return delay on there. But you can hear the impact it makes.
Whatever you give is what you give.
And if we want to go crazy, we could bring in some parallel compression as well.
Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give is what you give.
And now I would say the vocal sits a little bit more up front. It's more in your face, yet we haven't added in any real audible reverb tail, so it's not taking up like additional important space in the mix when we have other elements going on. So I'm very happy with that. That would be one example of specialty reverb application. And in this case, we did it specifically on a vocal, but you could try that really on any part. But I would say more so it goes to the important parts in the mix, the things that you want to stick through. So the things that are going to be really up front will tend to be brighter because realistically, that is how you hear them. The things that are a little bit further out can be a bit duller in character. All right, so let's now go on to this synth sound. And I'm not 100% sure if this is going to be the best application for a specialty reverb, but it might. And in this case, we maybe could add a little bit of a tail. So we're almost going back to a production reverb setting here where the person gave us a stem and there was no reverb on the synthesizer, but we want to try to make it a little more special.
Whatever you give.
So this might serve well with some kind of reverb, but we have to make sure that that reverb doesn't have too much low-end energy in it. There's a lot of low-end in this particular sound, and we want to try to keep that as clean as possible. So what I'm going to do is what we looked at before, which is I'm going to go and grab a layer here. And remember, if your DAW doesn't allow this, it's the exact same thing as parallel processing or even just processing on a send and return. I just think it makes more sense to put it all on that one track. Personal preference, nothing more than that. So we're going to add our dry version by just using a tool device. It's unchanged. I can even actually get rid of that after the fact and just call it dry. And then we're going to go in and add a reverb here. So the question would be, what reverb do I want to use? And the answer is, it's entirely up to you. It doesn't really matter because this is about doing something specialty. You actually want to hear this reverb. You want it to enhance this sound overall. So for this example, I think what I'll do is I'll go in here and use the old Skool Verb, just an extended version of what we looked at before with the Boogex. So luckily here I can turn off the dry signal entirely, so we just are left with reverb. And here's an example of a program, of a plugin that gives you a lot of additional controls on the reverb. Now, luckily, they give you kind of descriptions of what everything does, but this would be more of an example of a reverb where I would definitely start with a preset and then maybe kind of try to dial it in. All right, so let's just focus on this synth part and choose a preset that we think might work well. Even that doesn't sound too bad. But what I think I want here is a plate. Okay, as I said before, maybe we'll go with something a little more mechanical. We're not going to use a plate to be our mix reverb. That just probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I can go in and choose a preset like a plate. And let's go with the spatial plate. Or maybe the vintage plate. Let's try the vintage plate. Let's listen to this and hear how it sounds. I'm going to want to damp more of the low frequencies here. So if I bring this up, it's going to be damping the reverb for whatever's below this number. So if I go up to like 50, below 50 hertz. Actually, a little bit of that sounds good. A little brighter. We have a pre-delay. Now, this pre-delay sometimes works well, sometimes it doesn't. And as you'll read on the description here, reverb pre-delay time, lower values produce denser early reflections. Okay, so it's not really like a technical pre-delay, as the way I would normally define it, but we can mess around with this. You'll hear what it does. So you can hear how this is a lot of delay lines. When we move these things in real time, you're hearing like pitch shifting happening. Okay, that's normally what happens when we change delay times when we're like messing around in real time. So this really shows you how this is a bunch of delays all just being processed a little bit differently. One other thing that was off there was when we chose the preset, it did not mute out the dry signal. So this has been an unfair comparison thus far. Okay, that makes more sense.
Is why you give whatever you give.
So even a little bit adds another dimension to this particular sound, and I don't know if I would actually go with this or not, but I think for this example, I'm willing to stick with it, and if I need to go back and make changes, I will. So once again, here we are without any of the reverb, and I've also EQ'd it, obviously.
Whatever you give is why.
And here we are with it.
You give whatever you give.
And don't forget, we could go in and compress that as well, because there is a decent amount of volume shift happening throughout this part. So if we were to compress it, it actually might work better for the overall characteristic of this part. Bring it all a little bit closer together. You'll still hear that dynamic change happening on the dry, but you won't hear it so much as happening there on the reverb. So this time, let's go in and maybe use the Kotelnikov. See how this is going to work. This is going to be interesting. I've never tried to use this as a compressor on a reverb, so this will be fun.
Whatever you.
So I kind of want the reverb time to not last as long, and once you compress a reverb, you always have to go back in and adjust the time parameter because you're going to hear it for longer. That's the whole thing about compressing it, right? If we're limiting dynamic range, it's going to ring out a bit longer than what we might have anticipated. So that's better. That's what I want.
Whatever you give.
So I'm very happy with the way that reverb has now finally kind of been brought into the fold. So I'm sure in the actual video, I'll speed up the time it's taking when I'm tweaking settings, but I just want you to see and experience that you do have to go and tweak settings. Nobody is perfect. You might have an idea for what you want to accomplish, and you might try to get there, but it can take a little bit of time. It could take a lot of experimentation, and that's what I've done to be able to get that to sound, basically the way I wanted it to. Okay, so for the final example here of specialty reverb, what we're looking at is, of course, the snare reverb. So commonly you might put all of your drums into a reverb, like a drum room, to bring them together, but oftentimes I just prefer using parallel compression as a means of gluing it together. I don't necessarily think you need the additional reverb. For some styles of music, it works great. For other styles of music, it really doesn't. And I think in this example, since we only have a kick, a snare, and this like kind of synthy sound for the open hat, I don't think it would be appropriate to apply a drum reverb. So instead, I'm just going to focus on the snare specifically. All right. So again, we could go in here and we could use ascend and return, or we can do it in parallel. In this example, we'll do ascend and return and call it snare verb. And again, the focus here is to make sure it first of all sounds good on its own, but then listen to how it works in context. So I'm just going to solo out the snare for now. And let's go and add a reverb on here. So let's first start by using this old school verb, and you're going to notice some issues with it. So I'm going to go back in here again, turn this off, go in and find a preset. Let's use, we could even try here smooth reverb, okay? And I'm going to turn this off. And let's listen to how this sounds when we start to feed it in. Okay. So what I want you listening for is the end of that kind of tail-like part where it kind of sounds a little bit like crinkly, a little bit like granular. I don't know the exact term for this, but we really want to smooth it out. So even by going in here and choosing what they consider to be the smoothest reverb, it doesn't work all that well. Let's try using something else. Let's go in here and try the vintage plate again. Yeah. So for certain sounds, this might work. I don't think it would work in this case. I want to go with something that's very smooth, very kind of diffuse, so to speak, if we're going to use that term. And this probably isn't going to do it for me, but you never know. It might work well in context.
Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give is what.
And upon blending it, it actually doesn't sound all that bad, but I'm just going to get rid of that one for now, and let's try another example. Why don't we go in and try the Tau 4 and see how that works, see if it's going to be able to be dense enough for us. So this one, all it really gives you is a size parameter. We're going to turn the dry off here, put the wet all the way up, and just listen back and see what we can get. So, hello. Might use some pre-delay. Get it right in the zone. Maybe something like that. Because again, let's remember that with the snare, it's something that's really up front. It's really hitting us in the face. So we want to have that initial pre-delay going.
Whatever you give is what you give. Whatever you give.
So a little more tweaking and that might actually work. And this is why you kind of have to go through and try your different reverbs and just see what fits best for any given part. For our example here, we want a kind of smooth reverb happening on the snare, but for your music, it might be fine to have something that's a little bit more granularized or kind of what I just call like crunchy. So let's try our last reverb and see what kind of settings we can come up with there. And go back to the mix tools here. And again, since we're going, we want to put 100% dry wet. And again, I'm probably going to try to put the listener up maybe a little bit closer. And this would be a good example here of maybe wanting to have the size be a bit longer so we get some more of that pre-delay.
Whatever you give.
So let's increase diffusion and see if that will help. Not so much. Let's try this. Okay, that's helping a little bit. And now using this late control here, we will be able to obviously add a little bit of a longer tail and overall like a smoother one too. And then one thing to remember is if we do want just like a straight up, like genuine delay happening before the reverb kicks in, we can go and we can use our standard delay here. All right. And in this example, I do want both to be at 100%. I'll just put it in link mode. I don't want any ping pong. I don't want any kind of feedback at all. All I want is that initial delay. So when the strike hits, we get some time before the reverb comes in. And this might be a good example to use sync. And let's just hear what we can come up with. Interesting. Probably this would be the best. Yeah. Cool. So let's try this in context.
You give is what you give. Whatever you give.
Probably go and even add more decay time.
Whatever you give is what.
Okay, so those would be a few examples of specialty reverb. I know this has been a very long video, but that really is because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of tweaking. It's impossible to say these are the settings that you're going to use in every example. And as you could see here, I had to be creative and I had to add just a straight up delay before I even went in and went with the reverb. That was the only way to kind of get the effect that I wanted. And you could even go in further again and you could EQ this if you want to get rid of some of that low end boominess that's happening. You might consider doing that. But it's all about practice. It's all about experimenting and trying to find what fits best, having an idea of what you're going for, and then with the knowledge you have, trying to achieve that. And again, if none of these worked, if all of these sounded bad, I would just leave it off entirely and I'd have no problems doing that, and you shouldn't either. All right, so in the next video, it's going to be a lot shorter, and we're just going to talk about a specific mixing reverb, so to speak. So putting everything into a singular space.